Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's Tennis, brought to us by Nintendo. Another one of the classic black box NES games, Tennis, while pretty simple in its execution, is still a pretty fun and early sports title for the NES. While of course the game is very simple, it does offer a couple of modes of play, as well as several different difficulties in order for you to enjoy, and each difficulty does increasingly get tougher and tougher. So here we go with Tennis for the NES. In this run of the game I will be playing a singles game because unfortunately we can't play a doubles match unless we're playing two-player, in which case both players play on the same team trying to take on two computer opponents. After selecting single player, I then can select what level of difficulty I would like to take on, which I'm going to be selecting the hardest difficulty, and then the game begins. You play as the blue shirted tennis player against the black shirted tennis player, and it's a back and forth matchup of a classic tennis match. The game is a typical best of 3 set. There's no options to do a best of 5 set, which is something you really don't see in any of the Nintendo tennis video games, but of course does happen in real tennis. While the basic with tennis is I hit the ball to you, or you hit the ball to me, and if I'm able to hit it back, then it continues going, but if I miss it, you end up getting a point. There's a lot more detail than that, and you'll see throughout there's out of boundses as well as faults that can happen on your serves, and a few other things. Then the scoring system, which is probably the most complicated thing about tennis, and I am very, very far from an expert. In fact, a lot of what I learned about tennis and some of the other sports really came from Nintendo and some of the Nintendo sports titles, including this one. Basically, it's a one-on-one match that is broken up into up to 3 games, and then each game is broken up into individual sets. The first person to score 6 sets ends up winning a game. To win a set, what you have to do is you have to score a certain amount of points over your opponent. For example, when I score once, I go up to 15. When I score again, I go up to 30, and when I score the third time, I go up to 40. If I'm able to score again while I'm at 40, I win the set. However, in tennis, the rule basically is you have to win by 2. So, if both me and my opponent are at 40, we actually have to score twice in a row in order to win the set. When you score on a 40, you end up going to advantage. Once you score on advantage, you end up winning the set. However, if your opponent scores while you're on an advantage, it goes back down to 40 for 40, and you continue the process until eventually, finally, someone wins the set. There's also tiebreakers when it comes to the games. If both players end up winning 6 total games, then you have to do even more tie-breaking, and it's something that's a little bit difficult to kind of explain everything that goes on, so there's plenty of guides out there if you're really interested about learning the rules of tennis. For those who already know the rules of tennis, you already know I'm probably butchering and botching everything I'm probably saying during this. But let's talk about the actual individual game now. You've been seeing that I've been hitting the ball back and forth on the opponent, scoring a few points here and there. In NES Tennis, you have 2 different hits you can do. One lobs the ball over the net, kind of in an arcing pattern way up into the air, and the other one's more of a straightforward hit. I'll do my best to kind of explain things basic terms as much as I can. However, just having the 2 different types of hits, there's all kinds of different ways you can hit the ball. Depending upon where you're standing and where you make contact with the ball with your racket, ends up depending upon where the ball ends up going. Also, depending upon which side of the ball you end up hitting will also determine where the ball goes. So if the ball's coming at me and I hit it swinging my racket with the right side, it'll go one way, but if I turned around and swung it on the left side, it may go a different direction. Learning this definitely takes time, and of course when you first play up the game, you're going to be playing on the first level difficulty, because beating the computer on the hardest difficulty right away would be a major feat. Being a sports title, there's quite a few different ways you can go ahead and approach the game as far as what kind of hits you prefer over others, whether you like to play close to the net or far away from the net. These are all decisions and stuff that you'll learn as you're playing throughout the game multiple times. You'll figure out what you like best. However, with the really tough opponent that I'm facing here, with the level 5 opponent, well, playing the net is almost impossible because he will end up spiking the ball on you pretty hard. There's also some advantages and disadvantages for what kind of hits you end up hitting against the computer, and the computer in this level of difficulty doesn't make very many mistakes. The major mistake that the computer consistently likes to do is double faulting. Basically, when you serve the ball to the other person, the ball has to, of course, clear the net. It has to then bounce once, and then the opponent can actually make contact with it. If the ball does not go within certain lines on the serve, it's a fault. Or, of course, if it ends up hitting the net, it's a fault. If you end up faulting twice in a row, that gives a point to your opponent. As you saw with my last set, that was the first time I was actually making it up to a 40-40 score and had to get the advantage over the opponent in order to actually win that previous set. Learning also where you can have your tennis player, where you'll actually be able to make contact and the correct contact that you want, is really kind of a trial and error thing. The game is actually pretty intuitive as far as being able to hit the ball many different directions. It's not the same basic hit every single time. Whether you're just slightly a few pixels over to the left or right or back or forward, when you hit the ball will make all the difference on where the ball will end up going. Is it perfect? No, it's far from perfect, and tennis on the NES is probably not even the best tennis game available for the 8-bit console. However, it does offer a decent variety of hitting, and it plays pretty darn well. And being such an early NES title, Nintendo did a pretty darn good job of introducing the sport to many young gamers. The AI on level 5, like I mentioned before, really doesn't make many mistakes other than the double fault. He will sometimes miss the ball and end up hitting it out, or you'll be lucky enough sometimes to get an ace. And an ace is when I serve the ball and score instantly on the serve. It goes right past the opponent, and it makes legal contact, aka within the lines, and bounces once before going out of bounds. And of course the opponent was unable to volley the ball back to me as well. If you give the opportunity to the opponent, hitting the ball to him when he's close to the net and he's able to make contact, he's going to spike the ball very hard at you, and you may have a really tough time initially being able to hit that ball back. If you see him getting ready to play the net and spike the ball at you, my best recommendation is, of course, to lob the ball back over the net, to send him a little bit farther away from the net, giving you an opportunity to kind of regain your composure and set back up for the next hit. The momentum as far as hitting the ball out of bounds can be rather annoying at times during this game, and I found myself getting a little bit frustrated when practicing until I got more used to the game on not hitting the ball out of bounds on certain hits. It just adds a little bit of frustration and difficulty factor to a game that's already pretty tough, especially on the higher difficulties. After winning my 6th set in game number 1, we now move on to game number 2. Here, once I'm able to win 6 sets once again, the game will be over, and I will end up getting a victory. While NES Tennis may not really be remembered too much as far as modern day gaming goes, it does have a few nice touches and history to it and re-releases, including, of course, as you've noticed, Mario is the referee. During this era of the NES, they were really establishing Mario as, of course, the mascot for Nintendo, and because of this, Mario ended up appearing in many NES early titles, especially as a referee in certain games, such as this, and of course the legendary Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Also to note that this game was pretty much exactly ported over to the Game Boy when it was first launched in the early 1990s. The port over to the Game Boy is pretty much the exact same game with just a few minor changes, and is still a pretty fun portable tennis game. Of course, probably not the best tennis game overall on the Game Boy, but still a very fun one. Tennis also has kind of the distinction of being a launch title not only on the NES, but was also, of course, a launch title on the Game Boy. There's not a whole lot of other Nintendo brand titles that can have that distinction. Besides, of course, the Game Boy version I previously mentioned, the game has been re-released a few times on virtual consoles more recently, as well as, of course, was featured in the GameCube game Animal Crossing as one of the playable NES games you could get for your house. And while this was the first real attempt at a tennis game from Nintendo, this wouldn't be the last time Nintendo dabbled in the tennis game, as of course, teaming up with different developers, they made the Mario Tennis series years later on the Nintendo 64, including also having a Game Boy Color game, a GameCube game, and most recently a Nintendo 3DS game. Heck, the Game Boy Color game for both Mario Tennis and Mario Golf are two of my absolutely favorite portable sports titles that were ever made. And of course, the console games like Mario Tennis 64 is one of my favorite games on the N64, even if I did get quite frustrated with some of the later difficulties. The fact that the game also featured a two-player option with a doubles match is probably one of the most interesting and best aspects of the game. Being able to play the game with a friend and can still do some pretty difficult matches against the opponents makes the game really fun to play with a friend. The only kind of disappointing thing is, of course, there really isn't any kind of story mode to the game or point system or anything like that, and your real goal is just, well, to beat the 5th hardest opponent, and then you can keep playing him over and over again. Kinda, I guess, if you start with the level 1 opponent and then work your way through, the game definitely has a little bit of length to it. But once you've mastered the earlier difficulties, and of course can play against the level 5 difficult opponent, there isn't a whole lot to the gameplay at that point. However, getting to that point and being able to compete against the level 5 difficulty opponent takes a little bit of time for sure. I also find it weird that with the AI, sometimes the game will be so relentless that you'll not be able to get a point for a while, having to volley the ball back and forth for a while before you're able to actually finally get a point, or of course the opponent will finally score on you. However, sometimes the AI in the game seems to fluctuate, and he'll have a streak of bad luck, you could say, where he'll double fault a lot, or he'll just plainly miss easy targets that he normally would cream against me, he'll just let go by. I guess kind of in a way realistic that it would seem that, everyone has their ups and downs during a long tennis matchup. However, I don't think it's really programmed that way. I just think it kind of is coincidental that he has those streaks of bad luck at times. Here I have the final set against my opponent, as I'm able to get the first point there. Of course, with him serving, I'm always looking for that fault, and I found moving around a lot of times before the serve will sometimes throw the opponent off, causing the fault to happen more often from the level 5 AI. But once again, this could all just be coincidence and have really no bearing on the game at all. For example, here I moved around a little bit, and now I'll move around again after the first fault, and he ends up double faulting. Like I said, I really don't think this actually affects anything, but it seems to happen more often than not. On the final point though, I'm able to spike the ball over the net, get my last point and win Game 6, and end up winning the game, set, and match. After completing it, it'll then say move on to the next player, and you start the matchup all over again. However, it's still the level 5 opponent. He doesn't get any more difficult, similar to some other of the Nintendo sports titles like 10-Yard Fight. But anyway guys, that's going to wrap up this edition of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.